Nolan Pratt's house went up for sale 11 days after the grand jury indicted him. Century 21 sign in the front yard, already leaning in the mud. My name is Ezra Caldwell. I grew up in Grafton, Vermont, and the man who just lost everything, his seat on the select board, his business, his name, used to be my best friend. We were inseparable from age 7. I mean that. Nolan Pratt was like a brother to me, and he helped kill a kid named Colby Rennick and let the whole town believe it was a drowning. I spent my whole adult life knowing it. Nobody listened. They ran me out, and then I came back. If you want to hear how a town buries a boy and then buries the truth for 2 decades, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications. Because what Nolan said to me when I first came back, what he said to my face, in front of people, I still can't repeat it without my hands shaking. And what happened at that kitchen table is going to stay with you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I want to know who's hearing this. It started with a phone call. February 9th this year. My mother's neighbor telling me she had died in her sleep. I hadn't been back to Grafton in 4 years. Before that, it had been 6. I came for a funeral in 2016, an aunt, stayed 2 days and left. That was the pattern. Get in, get out, don't stay long enough for anyone to remember I existed. I was living in Brattleboro by then. Had been since 2011. Before that, Burlington. Before that, a couple of years in New Hampshire doing framing work that I don't remember much about because I was drinking through most of it. But by 2026, I was sober. I had a contracting business, small but steady, and I had a life that didn't include Grafton. My mother and I talked on the phone. Every Sunday, sometimes Wednesday. She never asked me to come home. I think she understood. See, the thing about Grafton, it's a beautiful town. I mean that honestly. Old, white, clapboard houses, stone walls running through the woods, a covered bridge that tourists drive 40 minutes to photograph. Population hovers around 600. Everybody knows everybody. And everybody decided 20 years ago that a 15-year-old boy drowned in an abandoned granite quarry on the east side of town, and that was the end of it. Colby Rennick, 15 years old. I remember this one time, it was maybe October, the fall before he died. Colby saw old Mrs. Thurber trying to carry 2 bags of rock salt up her porch steps. He didn't even say anything. He just jogged across the road, took both bags, carried them to her kitchen, and came back like it was nothing. I was standing right there. He wiped his hands on his jeans and said, "She's got bad knees, that's all." That was Colby. He wasn't performing kindness. He just did things for people because it didn't occur to him not to. His mom raised him alone after his dad left for Albany when Colby was 3. Everybody in town knew Colby. Everybody liked him. July 19th, 2005. That's the date. Colby went out on a Friday night and didn't come home. His mother called the sheriff's office at 6 the next morning. By noon Saturday, they found his body in the quarry pool. Ruled it an accidental drowning. Case closed in 9 days. I was 18 that summer. Nolan was 18. We'd graduated from Green Mountain Union 2 months before, and I knew before the coroner even filed his report that something was wrong. Because Colby didn't swim. Everybody knew that. His mom used to joke that Colby was scared of water deeper than a bathtub, and the quarry was a 40-minute walk from anywhere Colby would have been on a Friday night. But I was 18, and when I started saying those things out loud, people looked at me the way you look at someone who's making a scene at a funeral. The first person who told me to stop was my mother. She said, "Ezra, I know you're upset, but the sheriff looked into it and that's how it is." I remember standing in our kitchen. The wallpaper was yellow with little white flowers. I can still see it. And I said, "Mom, Colby didn't swim. He was afraid of water. Why would he be at the quarry at midnight?" She didn't answer. She just dried a dish and put it away. The second person was Nolan. We were sitting on the tailgate of his truck behind the general store, and I told him what I thought. That the drowning didn't make sense. That somebody needed to look at it again. And Nolan, this is the part that took me years to understand. Nolan didn't argue with me. He didn't say I was wrong. He just got very still and said, "Ez, let it go. You're going to make yourself crazy." And then he said, "Colby's gone, man. Nothing changes that." He was right about that last part. Colby was gone. But the way Nolan said it, there was something underneath it. I didn't have the word for it then. Now I do. It was a warning. I kept asking questions anyway. I went to the sheriff's office. The deputy who'd handled the case, young guy, maybe 26, told me the file was closed and that I should talk to a counselor about processing grief. I talked to Colby's mother, Gail. She was broken. She couldn't barely get sentences out. But she told me that Colby had mentioned going to meet someone that Friday night. She didn't know who. I talked to Harlan Keefe, Colby's boss at the lumberyard. Harlan was in his 50s, lived alone, had a temper. People in town were careful around him. I went to his place on a Saturday morning. He was on his porch, coffee in one hand, and when I started asking about Colby, he set the mug down real slow and said, "I don't know what you think I know, but you're asking the wrong person." The way he said it, quiet, measured, looking past me, it felt like a man choosing his words very carefully, like there was more behind it. He told me to get off his property. I left thinking I'd just looked the answer in the face. That's when the whisper campaign started. Not from Harlan, from somewhere else. I'd walk into the diner and people would stop talking. My mother got a call from someone, she never told me who, saying that I was making trouble and that it reflected poorly on our family. The pastor mentioned during a conversation that was supposed to be about the church fair that grief can make young people see things that aren't there. Within 3 months, I was the town problem. The kid who wouldn't let it go. The kid who was probably on something. And Nolan, the guy I'd been best friends with since 2nd grade, stopped returning my calls. I left Grafton in January 2006. I was 19. I didn't plan to come back. So February 9th, 2026, my mother dies. I'm 39. I haven't lived in Grafton in 20 years, and now I have to go back to clean out the house. I drove up from Brattleboro on a Thursday, 2-hour drive. Pulled up to the house on Houghton Brook Road a little after noon. The house looked smaller than I remembered, which is something everybody says, but it was true. White paint peeling on the north side. A porch rail that needed replacing. My mother had lived there alone for 31 years. The first day was just boxes, closets, the attic. I filled 6 trash bags before I stopped for coffee. And I was fine. I was handling it. I was doing the thing you do when a parent dies and you're the only child, and there's no one else to sort through a lifetime of accumulated stuff. The second day, I found the box. It was in the back of the hall closet, behind a stack of quilts. A cardboard box, taped shut, with my mother's handwriting on the side. It said, "Ezra, private." The tape was brittle, old. She'd sealed this a long time ago. I had to use a utility knife to get it open, and when I did, the smell of old cardboard and dust came up in a wave that put me right back in that closet as a kid, hiding during thunderstorms. Inside were 11 VHS tapes. No labels except dates written in Sharpie on the spines. June 2005, July 2005. 2 of them just said, July 19th. I didn't own a VHS player. I drove to the Goodwill in Springfield and bought one for $8. I set it up on my mother's old TV in the living room, one of those heavy wooden console sets from the 90s, and I put in the first tape. It was home video, our home video. My mother had taped Nolan and me that summer, the summer of 2005. We were 18, stupid, sun dark, throwing a football in the yard. There was a cookout. My father was in it. He died in 2014, flipping burgers in a Red Sox cap. Nolan's parents were there. Colby was there. Colby was there, on the tape, alive, sitting on the porch steps eating a hot dog with one hand and petting our dog with the other. I hadn't seen his face in 20 years. He looked so young. I watched all 11 tapes that night, and the 2 marked July 19th, the night Colby died. Those tapes changed everything I thought I knew about what happened. Have you ever found something that made you realize the people you trusted most had been lying to you? Not about something small, about something that mattered more than anything? I'd really like to hear about it if you have. Drop it in the comments, because what I'm about to tell you about those tapes, it's the reason I'm sitting here telling this story right now. Here's what was on the July 19th tapes. My mother had been filming that day. It was a Friday.
There was a community picnic at the Grafton Firehouse. They used to do them every third Friday in summer. She had the camera out because my dad had won something at the raffle, a bird feeder. She thought it was funny.
The first tape was the picnic. Normal stuff. Kids running around, people eating, the volunteer fire chief doing his annual speech that nobody listened to. The tape ran until about 6:45 p.m. based on the timestamp in the corner. The second tape, the one that mattered, started later, 9:17 p.m. My mother must have left the camera running by accident, or maybe she didn't. I'll never know. But the camera was sitting on the kitchen table, pointed toward the back window, and you could see the backyard and the edge of the tree line. At 9:22 p.m., two figures crossed the backyard heading toward the quarry trail. The trail that started at the end of our property and wound through the woods about half a mile to the old granite quarry. One of them was Nolan. You could tell by the jacket, this red Carhartt he wore everywhere that summer. The other figure was shorter, harder to see. It wasn't Colby, different build entirely. At 10:47 p.m., an hour and 25 minutes later, the same two figures came back, moving fast. The shorter one was carrying something. I watched it 4 times. It looked like a backpack, and the shorter figure was limping. According to the sheriff's report, Colby Rennick drowned sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight, and his body was found the next morning at the bottom of the quarry pool. The report said there was no evidence of anyone else being present, but my mother's camera put Nolan Pratt on the quarry trail at 9:22 p.m. and returning at 10:47, 90 minutes before Colby was supposed to have drowned alone. I sat on my mother's couch at 2 in the morning, and the room felt like it was leaning. I actually got up and went to the back door and stood there with my hand on the frame, breathing cold air, because I thought I was going to be sick. My mother had seen this tape. She'd watched it. She knew what it meant, and she kept it in a box in the back of a closet for 20 years and wrote my name on it. All those Sundays on the phone, all those years of, "Ezra, just let it go." She knew. She'd known the whole time, and she chose to protect me instead of telling me the truth. She never told me. I spent the next 3 days in Grafton doing 2 things: cleaning out my mother's house during the day, and at night, I sat at her kitchen table and I went through every piece of paper she'd ever saved. Electric bills, tax returns, church bulletins, Christmas cards from 1994. I was looking for something. A note, a letter, anything that would tell me why she kept those tapes and why she never gave them to the sheriff. I found it in a Bible. Not the family Bible, a smaller one, leather-bound, that she kept on her nightstand. There was a piece of lined notebook paper folded inside the Book of Ruth, my mother's handwriting, dated August 2005. It said, "I know what I saw on the tape. I showed it to Gerald." Gerald was the sheriff at the time, Gerald Pike, and he told me it didn't prove anything and to keep quiet for Ezra's sake. He said if I pushed it, people would think Ezra was involved. I can't let them do that to my boy. That was it. 6 sentences. My mother went to the sheriff with evidence. The sheriff told her to keep quiet by threatening her son, and she did. I need to stop for a second here because, I knew my mother loved me. That's not the point. The point is that she was terrified. Gerald Pike told a grieving mother that her son would be implicated if she spoke up, and she believed him. She believed him because Gerald Pike was the sheriff, and my mother was a woman who went to church on Sunday and paid her taxes and trusted the people who were supposed to protect her. And Gerald Pike, who died in 2019, by the way, so he never answered for any of this, Gerald Pike knew what was on that tape, and he buried it. Now, I should tell you about Harlan Keefe, because for a long time, I thought Harlan was the answer. Harlan Keefe ran the lumber yard where Colby worked. He was a hard man, divorced twice. He had a complaint filed against him in 2003 by a neighbor's kid. The complaint was dropped, but people talked about it. When Colby died, there were whispers. Nothing official, but people said Harlan had been too interested in Colby, that maybe something happened at the lumber yard. And when I started asking questions in 2005, I was half looking at Harlan too. He fit. He was mean. He was isolated. He had that complaint in his past. The sheriff even brought Harlan in for a conversation. Not a formal interview, just a conversation, and let him go after 40 minutes. I spent weeks that fall convinced that Harlan Keefe knew something, maybe more than something. And I want to be honest about this. Being wrong about Harlan cost me, not just time, it cost me certainty. It made me wonder if I was seeing guilt everywhere because I needed someone to be guilty. That doubt followed me for years. I was wrong. Harlan Keefe was a difficult man with a bad reputation, but he had nothing to do with Colby's death. I know that now. The tapes proved it. The tapes showed two young men heading to the quarry, not a 50-something lumberyard owner. And here's the thing I need to say about that. I wasted months looking at Harlan, months where I could have been looking in the right direction, and I think that was the point. I think the whispers about Harlan weren't random. I think someone made sure people looked at Harlan instead of looking at two 18-year-old boys. Let me pause here, because this next part, this is where Nolan showed me exactly who he'd become, and I want you to think about this. If your childhood best friend, the person who knew every secret you ever had, every fear, every stupid thing you ever did, if that person used all of it against you to protect themselves, what would you do? Would you keep going? Would you walk away? I'd really like to know. Tell me in the comments, because I almost walked away, more than once. What Nolan did the week after I found those tapes, I still dream about it. I didn't confront Nolan right away. I want to be clear about that. I had the tapes. I had my mother's note. But I also had 20 years of experience being the crazy person in this town's story. I wasn't going to walk up to Grafton's sitting selectman and wave a VHS tape in his face without a plan. So I did what I should have done when I was 18. I called a lawyer. Her name, well, I'll call her my attorney. She was based in White River Junction, specializing in criminal consultation. I drove up and sat in her office for 2 hours and laid it all out. The tapes, the note, the timeline inconsistency, the fact that the original sheriff suppressed evidence. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated because I'd spent 20 years talking to people who interrupted. She told me two things. First, there's no statute of limitations on murder in Vermont. Second, she told me to go to the state police, not the local sheriff's office. The current sheriff was Gerald Pike's nephew. I filed a formal complaint with the Vermont State Police on March 4, 2026. I handed over both tapes. I handed over my mother's note. The detective who took my statement, older guy, maybe mid-50s, very calm, said they would review the materials and get back to me. Then I went back to Grafton, because I still had a house to clean out, and because, I'm going to be honest, I wanted to see Nolan's face. I saw him on a Wednesday, March 12th. I was at the Grafton General Store buying coffee and he walked in. 20 years. I hadn't been face-to-face with Nolan Pratt in 20 years. He looked older. Obviously, we both did. He'd put on weight in the middle, had a beard now, was wearing a Patagonia vest over a flannel. He looked like every other Vermont guy in his late 30s who'd done reasonably well. He saw me and he stopped. Just for a second, just a hitch in his step. And then he smiled. My stomach went tight. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. I could feel my pulse in my hands around the coffee cup. Ezra Caldwell, I heard you were back. I said, yeah, cleaning out my mom's place. He nodded, sympathetic face. Sorry about Margaret, she was a good woman. And I stood there and I looked at him and I thought, you killed Colby. You know you killed Colby. And you're standing here talking about my mother being a good woman. The woman whose silence you needed. There was a guy at the register, older, denim jacket, someone I didn't recognize, and he was watching us. Not trying to hide it, just watching the way people in small towns watch when something interesting is happening. I said, thanks, Nolan. His smile held, but right before he turned away, something in his jaw tightened. Half a second, like a muscle he couldn't control. Then he paid for his coffee, said, take care of yourself, Ez, and walked out. The bell on the door rang after him and the guy at the register looked at me for a second too long before turning back to his wallet. That afternoon, I drove back to my mother's house and noticed something I hadn't noticed before. The ruts in the gravel at the end of Houghton Brook Road. Tire marks, fresh ones, from a truck that had pulled in and backed out. Someone had been sitting at the end of my road. I couldn't say when. Could have been anyone. But I called my attorney and told her anyway. The next 10 days were strange. I was living in my dead mother's house, sorting her belongings during the day, and waiting for the state police to call me back. And the town was watching me. I don't mean that in a paranoid way. I mean it literally. When you've been gone from a place like Grafton for 20 years and you come back, people notice. And when the reason you left was because you were that kid who made trouble about the Rennick boy, people notice harder. The woman at the post office asked me how long I was staying. The guy who runs the gas station made a point of saying, "Good to see you back," in a way that sounded more like a question. And on March 15th, someone left a note under my windshield wiper while my truck was parked at the general store. It said, "Some things are better left buried. Go home." No signature, block letters on a torn piece of notebook paper. I took a photo of it with my phone and texted it to my attorney. That same week, I met Ruth Winslow. Ruth lived 3 houses down from my mother's place on Houghton Brook Road. She was 73, had lived in Grafton her entire life, and she had the kind of face that looked like it was carrying something heavy behind the eyes. She came over with a casserole. That's what people do in small towns. They bring food when someone dies, and I invited her in. We sat at my mother's kitchen table and she asked me about my life in Brattleboro, about my work, about whether I was married. I told her no, never married. Came close once in my early 30s, but it didn't work out. She nodded like she understood. She mentioned that my mother's garden had been beautiful last summer, that the roses along the fence had really come in. She said something about the kitchen, how my mother had wanted to redo the counters but never got around to it. Normal things, neighborly things, the kind of talk that fills a room when the real conversation hasn't started yet. And then she said something that made the hair on my arms stand up. She said, "Your mother talked about you all the time. She was proud of you, and she felt terrible about how things went when you left." I said, "What do you mean, how things went?" Ruth looked down at her hands. She was holding her coffee mug with both hands, tight. She said, "I shouldn't have said that. I'm sorry." I said, "Ruth, what did my mother tell you?" She shook her head. "Ezra, I've lived in this town a long time, and there are things I can't." She stood up. She apologized again. She left. I stood in the doorway and watched her walk down the road in the gray afternoon light. 3 houses. That's how far away she lived. 3 houses from a woman who had video evidence of a murder for 20 years. Nolan's about to make his move. Subscribe and leave a like, because what he did next, I still dream about it. March 18th. I was at the hardware store in Bellows Falls, about 20 minutes south, buying a new lock for my mother's back door because the old one had rusted through. $9 deadbolt, nothing fancy. I was standing in the aisle reading the back of the package, thinking about whether I needed longer screws for the strike plate, when my phone rang. Nolan Pratt. I picked up. He didn't start with the threat. That's not how Nolan worked. He said, "Hey Ez, how's the house coming?" I said, "Getting there." He said, "Those old places, man. My guys did a kitchen reno in Chester last month that went 3 weeks over. You're doing it yourself though, right?" I said, "Most of it, yeah." Then the pause. I could hear him shift the phone, and his voice changed. Not the tone, the speed. Slower. He said, "Listen, I heard you've been asking questions again. About Colby. I hadn't been asking questions, not in town. I'd filed a complaint with state police and talked to a lawyer, that's it. Which meant either someone at the state police had talked, or Nolan had heard about Ruth's visit. In a town of 600 people, 3 houses apart, word travels in hours. And that thought, the thought that someone told Nolan about Ruth, made me wonder who else in Grafton was still looking out for him. I said, "I'm not asking questions, Nolan. I'm cleaning out my mother's house." He said, "Good, because I'd hate for you to go through what you went through last time. You were in a bad place, Ezra. People remember that." People remember that. 20 years later, and he's still using the same play. Ezra Caldwell was unstable. Ezra Caldwell was obsessed. Ezra Caldwell was a grief-drunk kid who couldn't accept that his friend drowned. But I wasn't 18 anymore. I said, "I appreciate the concern, Nolan. I'll be out of town in a couple weeks." He said, "That's probably best." I hung up. I stood in that hardware store aisle for maybe 2 minutes without moving. Then I walked to my truck, and I sat in the cab with the engine off, and my hands on the steering wheel, and I realized they were shaking. Not a lot, but enough. I held them up and watched them, and I thought, so you are scared. Good to know. I sat there a little longer, and I had this thought, this stupid, clear thought, that I was 39 years old, and I didn't have a wife, didn't have kids, didn't have a house I'd built for myself, which is the one thing a contractor is supposed to have. I had a rented apartment in Brattleboro, and a truck, and a good reputation with clients, and that was it. And I wondered, sitting in that parking lot, how much of that was because of Grafton? How much of those 20 years I spent running from this place had cost me the normal life I thought I'd have by now? The state police called me back on March 21st. The detective, the calm, older guy, said they'd reviewed the tapes in the note. He said the material warranted further investigation. He asked me to remain available. He asked me not to discuss the case with anyone in Grafton. That last part was hard, because the next day, Nolan Pratt made his move. March 22nd. Nolan called a meeting of the Grafton Select Board. 3 members total. Nolan was the chair. The meeting was public. I wasn't planning to attend, but the woman at the post office mentioned it, and something in the way she said it made me think I should go. The meeting was at the town hall. Small room, maybe 30 folding chairs. When I walked in, about 20 people were already seated. Nolan was at the front table with the other 2 board members. He saw me come in. His face didn't change. They went through the normal agenda: road maintenance budget, a zoning variance request, and then, under new business, Nolan said they'd received a complaint, he didn't say from whom, about harassment and intimidation of longtime residents by a temporary visitor to the community. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. He said, "This board takes the safety and comfort of Grafton residents seriously. We've been made aware that certain individuals have been approaching elderly residents with distressing questions about events that were resolved decades ago." I sat in my folding chair and I listened to Nolan Pratt, the man who was on that quarry trail the night Colby Rennick died, describe me as a threat to the community, in a public meeting, with 20 witnesses. And then he said it, the thing I'll never forget. He looked directly at me, not pretending anymore, just straight at me, and he said, "Ezra, I say this as someone who's known you since we were kids. You need help. What happened to Colby was a tragedy, but your obsession with it has been destructive to this community and to yourself. I think everyone in this room would agree that the kindest thing would be for you to seek the support you need and let this town heal." 20 people. He said that in front of 20 people. The man who helped kill Colby Rennick told me, in front of the town, that I needed mental help for caring about it. And no one said a word. Not one person in that room pushed back. A woman in the second row stared at the floor. The man next to her crossed his arms and shifted in his chair. The post office woman, the one who'd told me about the meeting, looked straight ahead with an expression I'll never forget, like she was trying to disappear into the wall behind her. They just sat there. I should tell you something about how Nolan operated. He didn't threaten, he didn't yell, he expressed concern. He performed sadness. He made himself the reluctant truth-teller who just loved his old friend too much to watch him self-destruct, and the town bought it. They'd been buying it for 20 years. That night, I sat in my mother's kitchen and I almost packed my truck. I'm not going to pretend I didn't think about it. Leaving again. Going back to Brattleboro and letting the state police handle it and never stepping foot in Grafton again. I sat at that table with my hands flat on the wood, and I put my forehead down, and I stayed like that for I don't know how long. A minute? 5 minutes? The house was dead quiet. My mother's clock was ticking in the hallway, and I was alone in the kitchen of a dead woman, in a town that had just watched her son's best friend call him insane for knowing the truth. That's a specific kind of loneliness I hope you never have to feel. I thought about what Nolan had done, the absolute insanity of it. The man who killed a boy, standing behind a folding table in a town hall, publicly telling the one person who knew the truth that he was crazy, and 20 people nodding along. That's what 20 years of silence buys you. But I didn't leave, because I kept seeing Colby on that tape, sitting on the porch steps, eating a hot dog, 15 years old and alive. Would you have stayed? If the town you grew up in had just watched a killer call you crazy, and no one, not one person, stood up for you, would you have kept going? Or would you have loaded your truck and driven south and let the state police sort it out? Tell me in the comments, because the reason I stayed is coming. The next morning, Ruth Winslow knocked on my door. She looked like she hadn't slept. Her eyes were red. She was holding a thermos of coffee and she said, "I was at that meeting last night." I let her in. She sat down at the table, same spot as before, and she was quiet for a long time. I didn't push her. I'd learned that much in 20 years. You can't make someone talk. You can only be there when they're ready. Finally, she said, "I saw them that night, July 19th, 2005. I saw Nolan and the Kellner boy go up the quarry trail." The Kellner boy. Bryce Kellner. He died in a car accident in 2011. He was the second figure on the tape, the shorter one, the one who was limping when they came back. I said, "You saw them." Ruth said, "I was on my porch. It was hot that summer, you remember? I couldn't sleep. I was sitting outside at maybe 9:15, and I saw them walking past your mother's yard toward the trail." She stopped, looked at the table, started again. And then later, I don't know, an hour, maybe more, they came back, and the Kellner boy was moving wrong, and Nolan was talking to him, low, like he was, I don't know, calming him down. She picked up her coffee, then put it down again. Her hands were shaking too hard to hold it steady. I should back up. I need to say, when Nolan's father came to see me, that was after. She closed her eyes. No, wait. First, I told your mother. The next day, I told her what I saw, and she told me she had it on tape. And then she told me she'd shown it to Gerald Pike, and Gerald said it didn't mean anything. I felt sick. And then Nolan's father came to see me, Ruth said. He came to my house on a Sunday afternoon. Very polite, very calm. He said he'd heard I was talking about things I didn't understand, and that it would be a shame if people started questioning my judgment at my age. He mentioned my property taxes. He mentioned that the select board had discretion over certain assessments. Nolan's father, who served on the select board from 1987 to 2013, who died in 2018, who threatened a woman's property taxes to keep her quiet about a dead boy. Ruth said, "I've been carrying this for 20 years, Ezra, and I watched that meeting last night, and I watched him do to you exactly what his father did to me. That moment where he looked at you and said you needed help, his father used those same words on me, almost exactly, and I can't do it anymore. I can't sit here and watch it happen again." I asked her if she'd be willing to talk to the state police. She said yes. That one word, yes, was the bravest thing I heard in Grafton, Vermont. The truth is something you carry with you, and it gets heavier every year you don't set it down. I need to tell you about the day it ended. April 2nd, 2026. The state police had been investigating for 3 weeks. They'd interviewed Ruth. They'd enhanced the tape. Apparently they can do things with old video now that weren't possible in 2005. They'd pulled the original case file and found that Gerald Pike's report contained inconsistencies that, in the detective's words, raised significant questions about the integrity of the original investigation. But they hadn't arrested Nolan yet. They were building. And I was still in Grafton, sleeping in my mother's house, waiting. I was standing at a threshold. I could feel what was coming. I could feel the weight of it. And there was a part of me, a small, tired part, that wondered if Nolan was right. Not about Colby, about me. Whether I'd spent so much of my life on this that I didn't know who I was without it. But then I'd think about Gail Rennick, Colby's mother, who moved to Rutland in 2007 because she couldn't stand living in the town where her son drowned, who never got an answer, who was 61 years old and had spent more than half her life without her boy. On the morning of April 2nd, I got a call from the state police detective. He said they were ready to move forward with the case, but wanted me to know that Nolan's attorney had been in contact. Nolan knew. He knew the investigation was real, that Ruth had talked, that the tapes existed. That afternoon, I drove to Nolan's house. I don't know exactly why. The detective had told me not to. My attorney had told me not to. But I'd known Nolan Pratt since I was 7 years old. I needed to look at him. His truck was in the driveway. I knocked. He opened the door. He looked smaller than he had at that select board meeting. His eyes were red. He'd been drinking. I could smell it, and I know what it smells like because I spent 3 years drowning in it myself. He said, "You should go." I said, "I know what happened to Colby, Nolan." He said, "You don't know anything." I said, "I have the tapes. My mother's camera was running that night. She showed them to Gerald Pike 20 years ago, and he told her to keep quiet." Nolan leaned against the door frame. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Your mother should have kept her mouth shut." Even then, even at the end, he couldn't stop. I stepped inside. He didn't stop me. We sat at his kitchen table. The same table I would later watch Ruth Winslow sit across from him and tell him what she saw. But that was 12 days later. Right now, it was just us. And I said, "Tell me what happened." And Nolan said, "It was an accident." He was crying, quietly, the way men cry when they've been holding something for so long that it comes out sideways. He said they'd gone to the quarry that night, him and the Kellner boy, to meet Colby. Colby had found out about something Bryce had done. Nolan wouldn't say what exactly. Something with money from the lumber yard. Colby was going to tell Harlan. They argued. He stopped talking, just sat there with his hands around the beer can. I said, "Tell me the rest." He closed his eyes. He said Bryce pushed Colby. Colby fell, hit his head on the granite lip of the quarry pool and went into the water. They pulled him out, but he was already gone. Nolan got up from the table, went to the sink, stood there with his back to me for maybe 30 seconds. Then he came back and sat down and said something I don't think he'd planned to say. We stood there for a long time. Over him. I don't know how long. 10 minutes? 20? Bryce was crying. I wasn't. I just kept looking at him and thinking, this isn't real. Then he said, "We put him back in the water and we went home and we didn't say anything." They put him back in the water. They put a 15-year-old boy back in the water and walked home and let his mother spend the next day calling every number she could find, trying to locate her son. I said, "And then you spent 20 years making sure nobody found out." Nolan said, "My father handled it. He talked to Gerald. He talked to Ruth. He talked to my mother. I didn't ask him to. He just did it." I said, "And you let him." Nolan didn't answer. And then, this is the part I didn't expect. For about half a second, I saw something in his face that wasn't self-pity. It was genuine horror at what he'd become. Like he was looking at the last 20 years all at once and seeing the shape of it clearly for the first time. Then it was gone. And he was just a man sitting at his kitchen table with a beer he'd been drinking since noon. I left. The state police arrested Nolan Pratt on April 8, 2026. The charges were involuntary manslaughter. The Kellner boy was deceased, so Nolan bore it alone, and obstruction of justice. His father and Gerald Pike couldn't be charged. They were dead. But the grand jury indicted Nolan on April 19th. The aftermath hit Grafton the way weather hits a mountain town. You can see it coming, and you still can't prepare. The story made the Brattleboro Reformer and then the Burlington Free Press, a 20-year cover-up in a town of 600 people, a sitting selectman charged with manslaughter, a sheriff who suppressed evidence, a family that silenced witnesses. It was everything Grafton had spent 2 decades pretending didn't exist. Nolan resigned from the select board on April 11th. His contracting business, he'd been doing residential work in the area for 12 years, lost 4 clients in the first week. His wife, who I'd never met, moved to her parents' place in New Hampshire with their 2 kids within a month. By mid-May, the business phone line was disconnected. His website went down. 12 years of building a reputation undone in 6 weeks. And the town itself, it started to crack. Conversations that people had been having in whispers for 20 years were suddenly happening out loud. At the diner, at the gas station. I heard from 3 separate people that the old sheriff's handling of the case was common knowledge. Their words, not mine. Common knowledge that nobody did anything about. The zoning board quietly opened a review of assessments that had been approved during the years Nolan's father sat on the select board. Nobody said why, but everybody knew. And the people who'd sat in that town hall and listened to Nolan call me unstable, some of them started reaching out. The woman at the post office stopped me one morning and said, "I'm sorry, Ezra. I knew something was wrong back in 2005. People were talking about those boys in the quarry, and I heard things, and I told myself it wasn't my business. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. The pastor, different pastor than the one from 2005, called me and asked if I wanted to talk. I said no, but thank you.
Gail Rennick, Colby's mother. She called me on April 14th, 6 days after the arrest. I sat on my mother's porch and listened to her cry for about 10 minutes before she could get words out. She said, "Thank you for not giving up on my boy." That broke me. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. I sat on that porch after she hung up and I cried harder than I had since my father died. Not happy tears, not sad tears, just 20 years of it, all at once. 20 years. That's what they took from him. Ruth Winslow, the state police took her statement formally. She was a key witness, and the remarkable thing about Ruth was she wasn't scared anymore. I went to see her after the arrest and she was sitting on her porch and she said, "I should have done this in 2005. I know that." I said, "You did it now. That's what matters." She shook her head. "No, Ezra, your mother kept those tapes. That's what matters." She couldn't speak, but she made sure somebody could. I'm recording this in late May, almost 2 months since the arrest. The trial hasn't happened yet. It probably won't happen until fall, but the grand jury indictment is public, and Nolan Pratt's life as he knew it is over. I finished cleaning out my mother's house in April, sold it to a young couple from Massachusetts who'd been looking for a place in Vermont. They didn't know any of the history. I thought about telling them and decided not to. They'll hear it eventually. Everyone does. I went back to Brattleboro, back to my contracting work. I had a kitchen renovation waiting for me, a house over on Bird Street, and I'll tell you something. The first morning I showed up to that job site, 7 a.m., coffee in hand, tool belt on, measuring a countertop. It was the most normal I'd felt in months. Just measuring things, cutting wood, making something fit. I actually laughed. Standing in that kitchen with a tape measure and a pencil behind my ear, I laughed. Because after everything, the tapes, the confrontation, the select board meeting, the arrest, my mother's note in her Bible, after all of that, the best feeling in the world was measuring a countertop. I heard through someone, I'm not going to say who, that Nolan's house went up for sale, the Century 21 sign in the yard. And I heard that people in town weren't exactly lining up to buy it. Bad history, I guess. I also heard that Nolan moved in with his mother in Chester, temporarily, until the trial. That he doesn't go to the general store anymore. That people don't really call. That he sits in a house that isn't his, in a town that isn't his, waiting for a process he can't control, while the community he spent 20 years building around himself pretends he doesn't exist. You know, if you're still here, if you listen to this whole thing, I want to say something to you. This story took me 20 years to finish. 20 years of being the crazy one, the paranoid one, the kid who couldn't let go. And the only reason it ended the way it did is because 2 women, my mother and Ruth Winslow, kept the truth alive when everyone else was trying to kill it. My mother couldn't speak, so she saved a box of tapes and wrote my name on it. Ruth couldn't speak for 20 years, but when it mattered, when she saw Nolan pull the same thing on me that his father pulled on her, she walked over and she knocked on my door. If this story meant something to you, hit the subscribe button. Leave a like. Not for me. For Colby Rennick. For the Gail Rennicks out there who spent 20 years without an answer. For the Ruth Winslows who carried the truth when no one else would. This channel, every story on it, that's what it's about. People who didn't give up. Have you ever been in a town where everybody knew something but nobody said it? Have you ever been the person who said it anyway? Tell me about it. I read every comment, and I mean that. If you want another story, and there are a lot of them, there's one on the screen right now that'll keep you up tonight. Click it. I'll be here. My mother named the box private, but the truth was never supposed to be private. It was just waiting for someone to open it. Ezra Caldwell, Grafton, Vermont. And now you know.